Hi, and welcome to Tosini Freire's podcast, the connection between one of the Brazil top law firms, a variety of themes under the business law, and you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Clara Serva, partner and head of the Business and Human Rights Practice Area at Tosini Freire Advogados, and coordinator of our pro bono practices. As an interviewer with me today, I have Luis Carlos Faria Jr., Senior Associate from our Business and Human Rights team.
Great to be with you, Clara.
Today, Tosini Freire is honored to welcome the Finnish member of the European Parliament representing the Greens and Vice President of the European Parliament, Madam Heidi Hautala. In this legislature,
thank you for your invitation.
Thank you so much, Madam. In this legislature, she's a member of the Committee on International Trade and the Subcommittee on Human Rights, and also an alternate member of the Committee on Legal Affairs, among other relevant roles. Vice President Hautala was an active voice in the process for approval of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, known as CSDDD, which happened on April 24th. The directive contains due diligence obligations to companies regarding potential or actual human rights and environmental impacts, whether they arise from companies' own activities, their subsidiaries, or their global supply chains. The directive will have a relevant impact on human rights and sustainability agendas of business located not only in Europe, but all over the globe. For this reason, we are honored for having Madam Vice President Hautala with us today to talk about the recently approved CSDDD and other recent legislative advancements in Europe. Madam Vice President, you are most welcome. We recently saw the approval of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive on April 24th by the European Parliament. What are your thoughts on the approval? And in your opinion, what are the main impacts to be expected?
Yeah, thank you. Last week indeed was very, let's say, exciting because this has been quite a long way. I would say that ever since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 2011, some of us had been thinking that how to take this human rights and business agenda forward in the EU. And we had to wait quite a number of years. You know, at the beginning, the EU Commission was very concerned that some member states did not have a national action plan on business and human rights, while the EU had nothing, you know. So it was a contradiction indeed. And then I took the initiative with some other colleagues to establish an informal cross-party working group in the European Parliament on business and human rights, or as we call it, Responsible Business Conduct Working Group. This happened in 2017. So that was a bit of a milestone because then we started really to strategize together across party lines, together with different stakeholders. And then in the middle of the first COVID spring, we were very, let's say, thrilled to hear that the European Commission would come up with a legislative proposal on, at that time, I think it was called Mandatory Human Rights and Environment Due Diligence, which then on the way it got a new headline, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. Of course, the European Commission did not just like that come up with the idea, but there had been studies already for a couple of years on how the EU should strengthen its business and human rights agenda, and everything paved the way for a mandatory legislation. So indeed, after quite many complications and very complex negotiations between the member states and the Parliament, these are the two legislative arms of the European Union, with the help of the Commission, we finally reached an outcome last week in the Parliament. Now I must say that I have seen a lot of complications, but I'm still at the moment very optimistic that was, you know, we've left the complications on adopting the legislation behind, but then you know, the implementation to make this really happen on the ground and in reality in the business strategies and everything. So that will be quite a new period. That's why some of us said when we were, well, I would say we were celebrating of the outcome, that that we would now have reached the end of the beginning, you know. So the story actually starts to unfold now, and there I'm sure that there will be a lots of connections to other countries and continents, including Latin America and Brazil.
Yeah, it's about this last point that you brought, Madam, that I like to bring another question. How do you perceive that the CSDDD could impact on other European and international legislation regarding business responsibility to respect human rights and the environment? Do you think that the CSDDD will propel normative advancements in other countries? If so, in which terms and to what extent?
I would say that the impacts at this point, they are sort of twofold. The first, well, you may have seen that especially in some more influential global South countries, as we call them now. I don't know if the concept is relevant or not, but we've seen in Indonesia and perhaps to some extent in Brazil that they are sort of embarrassed. The governments are embarrassed that the EU is doing this to them, you know, because obviously this will have an impact, and it means that trade will be more you know, flowing more freely if companies take into account the production conditions and the, you know, labor rights and the human rights, environmental regulations in the countries of origin, and there they need the support of the host country. So that's the thing that I think for good, maybe, you know, I could almost understand why this negative feeling is about that. Again, the European Union comes with a regulatory imperialism. But then I have to say that the civil society also in these countries, including Brazil, Indonesia, they have been thrilled because they see that finally maybe we have something that flows across national borders, which can be used to prevent and mitigate human rights damage and environmental destruction that big companies are causing everywhere. And many of them, as we know, they are either European or at least that they operate in Europe. So this law will be relevant for not only European companies, but also to companies that operate in Europe. That, of course, creates a little bit of what we call level playing field. So the European companies would not have to be overly worried. But so this is the situation. And I commissioned a little study some months ago to look into these spillover effects, as I would call them, in other countries and continents. And one of the countries where we looked into the situation was indeed Brazil. And we saw that, and maybe you can, from your side, you can inform me more, but I understand that the overall perception and effects of the EU CSDDD legislation in Brazil are positive. But I'm aware that especially one piece of legislation which is already in place, the deforestation regulation, has caused a lot of turmoil also in Brazil. We can discuss it why and other reasons, but anyway, so and I've talked to Brazilian labor unions and civil society organizations, and they believe this is an opportunity to use. So we need to work much more internationally and across borders now.
Perfect, Madam. And yes, we've been seeing the draft of a national policy on business and human rights in Brazil, and we also have a bill of law that intends to create mandatory due diligence requirements for companies on human rights. So this is a very hot topic in our country as well. And
right.
by coincidence, yes, and by coincidence, on April 24th, the federal government had a hearing with specialists to draft the national policy. So we are very much engaged on this agenda nationally as well. I was very curious, Madam Vice President, to hear from you. If you could please give us a brief overview of the context of the European Parliament and the European Union's legislative production of new social and environmental standards for companies, such as what you mentioned, the European Union regulation for deforestation-free products, the whistleblowing, and the recently approved regulation on prohibiting products made with forced labor on the union market. How do you see this movement in terms of achievements, progress, and challenges to be addressed?
First of all, I'm also thrilled to hear about the developments in Brazil, and I like to learn more about them because I think we really need to interact at all levels. So on this legislation, which I would say it represents a kind of a new wave, a new approach. Not that new because, if you look at the SDG 12, it is about this sustainable production and consumption. So what we're doing now is, I think it's very close to fulfilling SDG 12 on sustainable production and consumption. And then we can see that Europe and European consumers, by the way, I have to be very humble because, as you know, already some weeks ago, we passed this World Overshooting Day, which means that on average, Europeans have now already used their fair share of natural resources for the whole year compared with the rest of the planet. So the consumption is a huge issue, and its impact and footprint, climate, environment, social. So it was discovered that up to 10% of global deforestation could be produced by our consumption of various commodities. And over several years, there was like forth and back about whether the right approach would be to regulate the supply chain and put in place accountability for companies. And now it's done. And well, it's almost anecdotal that in Europe, there have been, especially the farmers' unions, they have been very concerned that because obviously we cannot just ask other countries to stop deforestation of the production of certain commodities such as coffee and beef and soy and palm oil. We also have to practice what we preach, and the farmers' unions have been extremely worried that it might also have an impact on them. So it has to be like that, but of course, some of these consequences are a bit unintended. And also, I must say, concerning the African countries that produce cocoa, coffee, Brazil producing soy and beef, and I think a lot of coffee as well. So indeed, the situation is that we have to make sure now that we don't create more unintended consequences. Because you see, if the millions and millions of smallholders, of many are women in Africa and other continents, if they are somehow sidelined from these supply chains because of very strict traceability requirements, it's a disaster. And that's why I think the EU and EU member states have now understood that development cooperation and development assistance plays a big role here. And I'm very happy to see already some initiatives. And I hope it helps the smallholders of the world to keep producing. So then you mentioned the regulation, which was also adopted last week, on prohibiting placing in the EU market of products produced with forced labor. That, I must say, is really quite groundbreaking because we know that there are about maybe 40 million modern slaves in, worldwide. Some of them in our country. So it's not at all that Europe would be somehow free of this. So now, to my big surprise, it didn't take longer than maybe 2 years to convince the EU Commission that they should follow countries like Canada, Australia, United States, on doing that, because if we wouldn't do the same, what the others have done, then Europe was risking to become a kind of a free haven for products produced with forced labor, So now we have it, and it's. I also have to say that it does address forced labor within the European Union, not just outside. I can give you quite a sort of a touching and dramatic example. Here in the north, I'm close to the Arctic area. I live here, and we have plenty of berries in our forests. but the Finns are not anymore so eager to pick them and not to earn part of their living from that in the summertime. So there have been guest workers, seasonal workers from Thailand. And now it has been discovered that many of these Thai workers who come with permits for the seasonal work of picking berries in our forest, blueberries, lingonberries, whatever you have. I'm sure they're not quite like your berries. So anyway, now it has been discovered that they are indeed in conditions that are equivalent to forced labor. You know, recruitment fees and very poor accommodation, undefined long working hours, very poor pay, also, you know, avoiding proper payment. So I'm just saying that we are not doing that only to keep other countries somehow in order, but also to discipline ourselves. So this will now have to be enforced, and the EU customs authorities are very much in a key position. It's not going to be very easy because compared with the United States, where you have a very active customs and border protection, which has stopped batches of cotton from China and rubber gloves from Malaysia, and just to mention you the examples I know best, there's like it's one authority, but in the EU we have 27 customs authorities. So this creates a little bit let's say, concerned that how are we going to put this all in practice. But I hope everything goes well, because obviously the customs authorities know since many years that they have to fight against the imports of counterfeit products, you know. So this sort of illegal product import is not something completely new. So these are the main things. But you also mentioned the whistleblower directive, and yes, we have it now, and it does have a connection to this supply chain related laws, but it also applies to very domestic situations in hospitals and in companies and so on. But now very essential in the corporate sustainability due diligence directive is that there is a proper grievance mechanism for workers, you know, to make complaints. And it's also important that those complaints can be anonymous, because the worst thing that could happen is a kind of a retaliation. You know, if some worker uses his or her rights to complain or announce some illicit situations. So yes, this is very important. And maybe to close this part of the discussion, I would like to say that sometimes people in Europe, and maybe elsewhere, they believe that this kind of laws in Europe are somehow produced in the heads of EU sort of, you know, faceless officials, and then they kind of impose it on everybody. But this is not at all true, and the laws that we are now discussing have really come out of a very, very lively interaction between many stakeholders, you know, labor unions, civil society, progressive companies, progressive governments within the EU. So I would say that it's all these pieces of legislation are a wonderful example that society really can, you know, force the governments to act. And I think it's unprecedented in a way.
Perfect. And you mentioned modern slavery, and here in Brazil, this is one of our main challenges for sure. We do have a list known as the dirty list on modern slavery, but we do know that the list doesn't cover not even half of the potential cases of modern slavery in our country. So to do an adequate monitoring of cases of modern slavery is one of the key challenges in a continental country such as ours. But I was just willing to listen to you, Madam, about one last question. If you could just comment with us a little bit about what you consider that the Global South and Latin America will face specific challenges in implementing the CSDDD, and do you see any specific priorities to be observed by the companies here in Brazil or the European companies that operate in our country?
I think let's say that the context is that companies that are targeted by this legislation and who come to produce and trade in Brazil and in Latin America, they also can face quite a, let's say, difficult context in the host country. So, for instance, I tell you that a few years ago, we discovered in the European Parliament that the then Brazilian government was going to put in place a change in the law, which actually brought forced labor in some respect back in a legal way. So, if governments are continuing, I know that you have a new government which does different things now, but if governments would tend to act in this way, then the companies that would want to operate in your countries, they would face a very difficult situation and challenge, because obviously now when the companies are obliged to fulfill their duties of due diligence on environment and human rights and labor rights, then if they are operating in extremely unenabling business environment in terms of social and environmental standards, then it will be very difficult. So, but let's consider this as an opportunity, because I also believe that if we manage to set this right, then it will be a huge incentive to the host country also to play their part, because to attract investment, to attract sustainable investment means indeed that the host country also has to be sort of doing their share. I could give you an example from West Africa. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are producing a very big share of the cocoa that we produce in Europe. And there has been a very, very lively discussion on who has to do what. And we've understood that companies alone will not be able to manage such a very structural issue like child labor, which means that the government has to do their share, and the EU also has to put in place development cooperation to help Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to bring the children back to school from the fields. And we understand very well that most of the time poverty is the driver of all these unfortunate things like forced labor and child labor and environmental destruction. So it has to be a very lively interaction, and I believe that when Brazil is now discussing similar wave of legislation, this will be a great opportunity to continue to trade and import and export.
Thank you, Madam. Before ending our podcast, do you have any additional comments to our listeners? Any message to give to us?
Well, I'm super curious about any sort of negative perception of, let's say, we mentioned the deforestation regulation of the EU. So, what do you think that the EU should do to avoid any unintended consequences on smallholders, for instance? So, and is there at the moment some let's say efforts from the government side to help to put in place traceability systems that would make it possible for smallholders also to be a part of that supply chain? So I'm very curious from you and your listeners maybe on this.
Perfect, Madam. I think one of the key challenges is the traceability that you mentioned, because we have such a wide country. So we see our clients and companies in general facing a lot of challenges in implementing mechanisms to really know their supply chain, because very often they have layers and layers of suppliers. We have clients with about 7,000 to 10,000 suppliers. So we're talking about very complex supply chains. And at the same time, in very remote areas of Brazil that very often don't even have connectivity. So how do you do to implement mechanisms to really monitor, especially in social matters? Because, for instance, child labor is not something that when you go to see your supplier, not necessarily the child labor will be there at that exact moment.
Yes.
So those challenges are very complex to overcome. And also the fact that the federal government is now enhancing their mechanisms to monitor and identify potential violations. But the fact is that it's not enough to rely on official lists or official identifications of violations. So companies are now struggling and very often discussing this topic in a sectorial approach. So coffee, soy, infrastructure, those sectors are all joining and then discussing how to implement. And finally, I think that the last but major challenge is the fact that 99% of companies in Brazil are small or medium size. So when you're talking about the impact of major and transnational companies, the fact is that they all have to cascade their good mechanisms to very tiny companies that not necessarily have the corporate governance sufficient to implement supply chain transparency or due diligence mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I very much believe that what you said about cascading of the good developments to further to smaller companies is key. I hope that we will hear more from Brazil on this topic in the near future. So let's stay in touch. And thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Madam Vice President Hautala, for joining us and for reinforcing the importance of companies and other entities being prepared for the new human rights standards. Besides the global advancements, business and human rights is also on the agenda of the Brazilian National Congress through Bill 572 from 2022 and is a priority to the federal government that created an interministerial working group for the development of a national policy on human rights and business, as we addressed here in this podcast. The working group has been intensively working to engage with multiple stakeholders and to draft the policy. Advancements in Brazil regarding business and human rights are expected, and it's important to be prepared for the impacts from the European legislations and the national initiatives.
You're absolutely right, Liz.
Wonderful.
It is very important for companies in Brazil to be aware of the social impacts of their activities that they may have, and have attention to the impacts of national and international developments on the legal landscape of business and human rights. We'd like to thank Madam Hautala again for joining us for this podcast. To our listeners, do not forget to follow Tosini Freire in social media to keep update with the latest developments on ESG matters. Thank you so much, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. So let's stay in touch. Bye.